Welcome, everyone. I'm going to start out by wishing a warm welcome to everyone joining us online. Thank you so much for tuning in and letting us actually come to you tonight. And then my second welcome is to everyone here in the room, here with us downtown Ottawa. We're honored that you would join us. And especially if this is your first time at a Cardus event, welcome. We are very glad to connect with you. Cardus is a non-partisan think tank dedicated to clarifying and strengthening through research and dialogue the ways in which society's institutions can come together and work together for the common good. So this event specifically that you're joining us for is actually the finale event for a series of events that we held across Canada. We've been gathering data in partnership with the Angus Reid Institute that shows the changing nature of faith in Canada, but we've also been seeking to hear from religious leaders as well. And mingling those two voices together, we were able to produce a report, which is now published online, and we have copies of it here in person as well, which helps just illuminate the role of faith in Canada's lives and their relationships with their faith communities using all this data we've been collecting since 2017. So tonight we will begin with a 20-minute presentation, followed by a rich panel discussion here on stage. And then at the very end, there will be time for question and answer. So for everyone joining online, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You can send in your questions at any point and it will come directly to us. Or if you're here in person, you'll know when the time is right and you'll be invited to ask your questions. So without any further ado, I will kick it off and introduce Cardus's Executive Vice President, Ray Pennings. Ray is overseeing a myriad of projects and research initiatives here at all times. But today I will emphasize his work as the director of the Spirited Citizenship Program, which is the umbrella under which all of this Why the Faith tour has been happening, as well as this research with the Angus Reid Institute. So since we have all this data that we've been working on since 2017, I will invite Ray up to share his expertise with us tonight.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Rachel. To those from across the country, as well as those here in Ottawa, it's wonderful to be here with you this evening. My task is in 20 minutes to share with you a report that runs some 70 pages that is filled with 30 some odd graphs. I'm going to make no attempt to be comprehensive this evening. Rather, what I want to do is set up a discussion, sort of highlight a few of the key themes that emerge in this document, and then set up the discussion that we're going to have. In addition to the data that we have collected, and this report relies on 9 separate polls that we have conducted with the Angus Reid Institute since 2017. We've actually conducted, I think, 14 or 15 of them, but we're using data from 9 specific ones in this report. In addition to that, since May of this year, Father Deacon Andrew and myself have been privileged to be in 9 cities across the country. I don't know what it is about the number 9. I just realized now that there was nothing intended by that. I think it actually was supposed to be 10 to start with. But it was 9 cities in which we gathered, in each city, 20 to 50 faith leaders. About 90% of them were Christian, but we actually, in many of the cities, had an interfaith component to the discussion. And what we did is I took in most of those cases about 45, 50 minutes to present an array of data. And then we had over an hour to get their responses to that data and help us interpret the data. And so what you're getting this evening is a summary of both the data itself at a very high level, but more significantly, the response of faith leaders in terms of helping us to interpret that data and some of the themes. And what my intent to do is to just give you some of those highlighted themes and really set up a conversation. And that's my real focus tonight, to set up a conversation regarding the public implications of this for Canada. The thesis is quite simple. The landscape of faith is changing and changing very quickly in Canada. Even in the 5 years that we have been measuring, we have measured some noticeable changes that I'll highlight. But if we put it in a broader perspective over the course of a decade or two, there has been significant changes and the pace of change is accelerating, which means it's only reasonable to expect that the faith in Canada in 2025 and 2020 and 2030 is going to look very different than it does today. And our question for that, when we were on tour, we were asking faith leaders, what does that mean for your parish? What does that mean for your synagogue or for your local faith community? Tonight, we're going to focus a little less internally on faith, but rather, what does it mean for faith in public life in the public square? There are the place, respect, and expectations of faith institutions and communities, the role of the faith community in serving faith, the broader community. We understand that faith communities don't just exist for themselves. They also, in almost every faith tradition, there is a version of loving God and loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor flows out of your understanding of what does it mean to love God. What does that mean in a Canadian social context? And how do we, in an increasingly secular society that, as the data will show us, is increasingly hostile to certain expressions, particularly of faith, how do we develop a public vocabulary of talking about this, also among our differences? There are many ways to talk about faith. If you hop on our website, you can find a report we did a couple of years ago with a Washington economist, which looks at faith from the perspective of GDP. Any guess in terms of the contribution of faith to GDP of Canada? $67 billion. It's the ninth. If you would consider faith as a business, it'd be the ninth largest business in Canada. Huge implications on that. We usually don't think of, you can look at faith in many different ways. We don't usually look at faith in terms of its economic impact because that's not what it exists there for in the first place. But it does have a huge economic impact. It has a huge social impact. Obviously, you can look at faith from the perspective of beliefs. As I said, we have been focused on the public nature and impact of faith. If you have your document, if you're one of these people who is squirming, because unless I tell you exactly what the sample size was and what the margin of error was and what the sociological and statistical methodology is there, pages 51 through 60 are your friend. I'm not going to go through all of that. Suffice it to say, I'm relying on 9 surveys, and I'm not going to distinguish between them. They vary from 1,300 to 5,000. They've all been weighted in terms of, when I'm citing it, I'm weighting it in terms of representative data, unless I say otherwise, of the general Canadian population. And so anyway, the details for those of you who really can't accept any of the numbers, when I look at the numbers, even though it varies, I tend to use a plus or minus 2%. So frankly, for a change to be meaningful between two numbers, you need at least 4 points of difference. If you consider the low one was +2 and the high one was -2, they're about equal. Once it exceeds 4 or 5% of difference in terms of most of the numbers, we're actually looking at something that is statistically significant. I can assure you that all of the data has been done according to recognized academic standards in terms of the particulars, and you can read that along the way. Now, we start with faith in Canada. We may start where the newspapers were about 3 weeks ago when Statistics Canada released the results of the 2021 census. One of the things that highlights, this is taken from the Statistics Canada report, it would show the fact that faith is quite diverse across the country. And that's one of the points I do want to make tonight, that I am citing to you national numbers. And the reality is these numbers actually are accurate nowhere. We are a widely diverse country. If you take a look at the Statistics Canada, now remember this is, and this becomes a very important distinction, Statistics Canada, and in our report as well, we have the check the box question. So which box most accurately describes your faith? And that's what this data is based on. So it's self-identification of a label. We understand the labels mean different things to different people. It's self-identification of a label. So if you looked only at the Stats Canada data here, you might be surprised to see the province in which the lowest Christian rate of self-identification is Alberta. The highest is Newfoundland at 82%. Quebec, which ordinarily is thought to be One of the more secular, along with British Columbia, Quebec actually has self-identified Christians of 67.5%. One of the things you learn quickly is when you start looking at this data, there are some things that surprise you. No religion. I think too many people will be surprised to see that British Columbia at 52% has the highest level of those who hit, and this is a combination of agnostic, atheist, non-religious. There are 4 or 5 different options. A lot of these are combined together. Newfoundland is 18%. When it comes to the non-Christian religions, it will come as no surprise that Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario are the 3 regions of the country where you have the largest percentages, and those obviously reflect immigration patterns in the country. So the 2021 census, checking the box, 53.3% of Canadians, or 19.3 million Canadians, said they are Christian with various versions, and they asked denominations and that, and some of this is combined. 34.6% is next at no affiliation. Then we come down to Muslim at 4.9, Hindu at 2.3, Sikh, Buddhist, and Jewish. So that's Stats Canada 2021 data. One of the couple of things that one needs to account for in looking at this data, and we ask the identification question on our surveys, and most of them are very similar to this. There are slight variances depending on how and when you ask the question. There is a couple of things. Demographics make a big difference. Older people who are not religiously active in a particular way are far more likely to check a religious box than younger people are. We have a lot more Christmas and Easter Christians in the baby boomers than we do in the under 35s. So there is a very different set of standards towards identifying the box depending on where you are. You have, particularly in Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic traditions, much more of people who will check the box as a cultural statement as much as a religious statement. They were born in a particular context and they understand things about their context that may or not be particularly religious, but they understand that as part of their identity. When we started with the Angus Reid study in 2017, we thought we wanted to do something different than just check the box. The other most common way of doing it is looking at church attendance. You've all attended a presentation of one sort or another in which the speaker puts a box on the stage and talks about weekly religious attendance, which in the 1950s was somewhere around 60%, and it has gone down in Canada today. Last 7 days, 12% of Canadians attended a place of worship. And so they show that diagonal line, and voila, that is secularization. And they're not entirely wrong. There is something to that data. However, we wanted to have a more nuanced look. So we developed an index, and we developed this even before we collected the first data. We had a couple of academic committees, and we looked at some of the literature. And we decided, we originally came up with a list of about 30 possible behaviors to measure. We settled on this list of 7. So do you believe in God? Do you believe in life after death? Do you believe how important is it for parents to teach their kids in alignment with a religion? Have you had a religious experience or an encounter with God's presence? Do you pray? Do you read a scripture? Do you attend a place of worship? And the exact wording of these questions, these are summary, the exact wording of these questions as they are in the appendixes along the way. We basically said, if you do 6 or 7 of those things, we're going to call you very religious. If you do 4 or 5 of those things, we're going to call you privately faithful. And there's sort of the line down the middle between those 2 groups being the religious, the other 2 groups being less religious, spiritually uncertain. You'll see, and you can get the details, I'm only going to give you the highlights in terms of 2022. 16% are what we call religiously committed. They are doing 6 or 7 of those things. What's unique about that 16% of Canadians? A couple of things. If you were born outside of the country, you're twice as likely to be in that group as if you were born in Canada. So very strong immigrant element to that. It skews slightly older and female in terms of the overall population. But and this will become a recurrent theme tonight, if you're younger, under 34, You're more likely to be in this than one would expect on a per capita basis. And we'll come back to that theme several times. In terms of the people who do 4 or 5 of those, and most typically the ones that get left off are attendance at worship and reading of the scripture. So if they're doing 4 or 5, those are the 2 they're most likely not doing. So there's 19% of Canadians that fit that. They're much more involved in individual rather than corporate worship. What's interesting is this is where income starts playing a factor. There's a definite correlation in that group between lower income Canadians earning less than $50,000 a year. Part of my theory of that is that we have a lot of immigrants in lower social economic who are involved in service and retail industries. They are our new middle class, as Cardus Research and our Work in Economics program has shown, and they often are working the times when the rest of us are worshiping. And so the availability of worship for that segment of the population, which is a huge and growing segment, is not as convenient. 47% are spiritually uncertain, so they are doing 2 or 3 of those. They most likely, the 2 or 3 that are highest on the list, and there's a graph with all the amounts of all 7 in terms of where they're at, but they are most likely to say they believe in God, and they are most likely to want to educate their children according to a religious code. Those are the ones that are going to be highest in that particular group. What is interesting is more than half of those were not raised in religious households. This is where background is really coming in, and an increasing percentage of the population that were not raised in any religious tradition. And then we have the non-religious. What is very interesting here is that income and education is a factor. If you're more than 100,000, if you're university educated, you're disproportionately in this. There is definitely a correlation among that. What is fascinating in the midst of all of this, as you take a look, there has been a movement even in the 5 years. If you look carefully at some of the graphs that you have inside, you'll see that we have moved by about 10% out of the middle. So 16 and 19 is 35. We're at about 35% religious, about 65% non-religious. Our first surveys were closer to 40, 60, or even they were like 40, 42, 57, or 50. And every year we are seeing some change. And really what's happening, the ends have not really changed within the margin of, it's the middle that's changing. People are either moving to become more religious or more non-religious. There is what we call a hollowing out of the middle. Now, as we presented this to religious leaders across the country, several themes came out. And when you're reading your booklet, the non-yellowed background in the booklet is basically the material as we had prepared it in the spring, and the yellowed is the summary of religious leaders' feedback and interpretation. So the yellow is a little more editorial, and the rest of it is a little more just pure reporting of the numbers as we found them. A couple of things that came through. First of all, about community and identity. For those who are on the religious side of the spectrum, they are valuing very much the fact that not just religion in terms of their connection with God, but they're also their connection with fellow believers as they're gathering in worship. What is interesting is, and keep in mind that 3 of the last 5 years have been affected by COVID and the ability to gather in corporate gatherings. It was interesting how frequent the theme of technology came up. And what is fascinating is that most people, and especially young people, reject technology as an aid to worship. They want the church they attend to have a good website and a good app that tells them exactly when they need to be there, but they don't want technology whatsoever in worship. They're turned off by slick productions of online worship that don't feel real. It was just fascinating how much and in how many different ways. I highlight in the material 4 different ways in terms of technology is seen to be a negative. And in many ways, those who are turning, especially young people who are turning to worship, almost are turning as a reaction to the surface humanity that technology produces in terms of being online, and they're looking for a more incarnational or more wholesome experience that they're finding in the process of worship. We'll come back to that a little later. Politicization of a worship is also a major theme, particularly in a negative way in terms of explanation of why people are leaving worship. Now, we held these in the spring and fall of this year. Predictably, we talked more about COVID and churches' COVID responses and breakups of families in terms of all the politics surrounding that I really wasn't too keen on hearing it before we started, and I certainly was full of it by the time we were done. But that is where people's minds are at, and it's clear, it's almost universal. It doesn't matter what faith, it doesn't matter what denomination, progressive, conservative, orthodox, doesn't matter the label. The themes seem to have been somewhat divisive. The final theme is tensions between belonging and authenticity. And there are particularly young people who have been very turned off by what they perceive to be the hypocrisy of churches. Obviously, scandals and some of the things making the news were there. What is interesting is they don't want to pretend it's not there, and they're not going to leave just because it was there. They just want it to be honestly talked about. There's a sense of authenticity. There's a sense of, we want openness. We want transparency. We're going to be involved in faith. This is a place where you're vulnerable, which we talk about this. Another major set of issues around the youth and authenticity. As I mentioned along the way, when it comes to monthly services, it may surprise you. Between 2018 and 2022, the period we measured, monthly attendance, not weekly, but monthly attendance of services decreased from 24 to 15%. 9% decrease in just 4 years. Now, there's COVID as part of all of this. What is interesting is it did not decrease consistently everywhere. If you self-identify as an evangelical, 59% of you attend a place of worship at least once a month. Muslim, 27%. Every other faith group, less than 10% of those who check the identification box attend a place of worship at least once a month. The biggest surprise, men under 35. Between 2018, 2022, their attendance at worship increased from 14 to 22%. This isn't one survey that's an outlier. This is 9 surveys that show a consistent pattern. Young men are 9% increase in monthly church attendance among young men under the age of 35. Strikes me that's a story. When we take a look at 35 is somewhat the cutoff, and that's a bit arbitrary because that's the category if you're either 18 to 34 or you're 35 to, so whether it's 32 or 37, I don't know. 35 is the number we asked. What is interesting is those under the age of 35, 20% attending worship, those under 13%. So young people are attending church, synagogue, mosque, gurdwara, very differently. And our experience with faith leaders is that indeed was the case. Why is that? They're looking, as I said, not for the digital, but for the incarnational and an element of the mystical. Faith leaders across the board were telling us how they was a desire for the transcendent. They didn't want to come and have the surfacey sort of conversations and the lifestyle, how to raise your kids and that. They wanted the sacramental. These were the people who were digging deep in the historical and wanted to read church fathers and were digging much deeper into faith than the older generation. There was a sense of finding meaning in suffering. They wanted to talk about difficult subjects. They were going there for help in dealing with it. They weren't going there to avoid it, was the feedback that we received very much. What I found interesting is when it came to religious experience, our data suggests that 28% of Canadians report having some sort of an experience or encounter with God at least once a month. What is fascinating is a good number, especially older men, find it very difficult. The majority of them have never had one, they say, and yet there seems to be an aspiration for something of the mystical that comes in all of this. Differently religious. Let me put a caveat here, especially to those of non-Christian faiths. We attempted to put a tool together with the 7 items. That definitely is a more Christian tool than it would be, for instance, for Sikhs and Muslims for whom a sacred text is not as significant as it is for those of the Abrahamic faiths. Jewish people do not see the afterlife necessarily in the same sort of way as do Christians. So when you have an index of 7 and there are 1 or 2 that are received differently, that's why I find this chart particularly helpful, because I think it shows us 3 very distinct sorts of religiosity in terms of the behaviors of Canadians: evangelical Christian and Muslim. If you'll take a look at the line between the red-orange, which represents the religious behavior, and the yellow-green, which represents less behavior, we see we're at about 85% of those who identify are actively behaving in very religious ways, in both evangelical and Muslim. We have a second group, Hindu and Sikh, that are a little more around 60-40 in terms of that. And then you have Catholics, Jews, and Protestants that where that line is different. So there is a very different expression of religion that takes place. Doesn't necessarily mean, this would seem to imply one group is more religious than the other. I actually think that more accurate terminology is differently religious, respecting the different factors of their background. Depends on who you are. Let me very quickly just give you 3 one-sentence anecdotes in terms of regions. When we were in Saskatchewan, it was interesting to listen to the people talk about how ecumenical their faith was, and how in Saskatchewan they had much more in common with other faiths, and people of their own faith tradition who came from outside the province really didn't understand them. It didn't matter whether they were Baptist or whether they were Catholic or what they were in the room. They were all in it together as Saskatoonians over against the rest of the country. When we came to Halifax, what was interesting was the people who were from Halifax proper were talking about how different it was in the city of Halifax, which was very secular and had a certain anti-faith bias, as opposed to 1 hour away where the CBC on Sunday morning still carries the rural church service. Totally different ethos vis-a-vis faith and how you talk about it in public life. In Vancouver, we heard about lifestyle and how that faith is taking a second tier to all the different things that are on offer in terms of a certain lifestyle expectation of people who lived. So it was different not only in terms of the numbers, it was very different in terms of how people dealt with those numbers. Very quickly, we asked journey of faith. So we asked people where you were born and where you were today. What is fascinating, if you were born as a Christian, where are you today? 77% are still Christians. 19% have left for no religion. 7% have changed the denomination, and 3% have left for other religion. Turning the data around, in terms of if you are in the faith today, where did you come from? 67% stayed in your denomination, so you were there from the beginning. 7% changed, so that brings us up to the 74 who were born Christian. 25% came from no faith, only 1% came from other religions. Why did they join? What's interesting is there's no one thing that stands out. Obviously, there is belief. That is that the largest at 29%, marriage, tragedy, loss, the influence of a particular person, and there's a pretty significant other there, which is a wider range. There is no one factor that's driving. So what does this all mean in terms of our shared life together as I wrap up? First of all, faith is inherently public. Everybody in that group, Catholics, only 46% say they are public about their faith. Every other faith group indicates the fact that they are public about their faith. Their neighbors know their faith. They share it. It's not something they hide or is secret. It's quite clearly that evangelicals are somewhat different in that regard than others. It is interesting in terms of Muslims and Sikhs are close behind. Of course, many of them have very little choice, just given dress, publicly religious dress that's often associated with those religions. But there you see across the line, there's an inherent public faith aspect to it. When it comes to faith in public, there is a certain hostility, as we will see. But there again, I think the mood is changing. I think this is a very significant. I'm only showing one. We have several data points that point to the same trend. If you'll notice that, yes, 60% are saying, keep God and religion out of public life, and 40%. But take a look at the difference between the 18 to 34s and the 35s above. There's almost 10 points difference. Younger people are 10 points more likely to say God belongs in public life, and people of faith, politicians of faith, should be talking about it. Immigrants are the most enthusiastic. If you'll take a look at the difference between do you think the presence of each of these groups is a net benefit or damaging to society? Immigrants are overwhelmingly positive right across the board, except for evangelicals. They're negative on evangelicals, but they're way less negative than everybody else's. So what does this all mean? I want to suggest that it's for faith leaders and communities, it means that many of the approaches that they've had, they're having to rethink in light of a very changing constituency that they're trying to minister to, although that has a very different answer depending on where you are in the country. There is no commonality. There are tons of answers to that question. For public institutions and conversations, it's pretty clear that the country is changing from its historic makeup, and yet we rely, I mentioned the $67 billion to our economy way more significantly, and we'll talk about some of that tonight, is the delivery of care for the poor, delivery of mental health services, refugee services. There's a significant part of our social infrastructure that relies on faith and faith communities. What does this all mean? And how do we deal with difference? How do we develop a vocabulary so we can establish relationships among our neighbors so that we can talk about faith? And speaking of talking about faith, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Please join me in thanking Ray Pennings for his... We're now moving to the discussion portion of our evening, and I'd like to welcome up our panelists. And as they come up, I'll introduce them to you all. First of all, Dr. Jaspreet Kaur is the Ontario Vice President for the World Sikh Organization. The World Sikh Organization of Canada promotes and protects the interests of Sikhs in Canada and around the world and advocates for the protection of human rights for all. Jaspreet completed her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's. She's currently the Chair of Child and Family Studies at Centennial College. She's a community organizer and activist, and also the co-host of the podcast Ask Canadian Sikhs. Carrie Kojarok is the Executive Director of Ve'ahavta. Ve'ahavta is a Jewish humanitarian organization in the GTA dedicated to promoting positive change in the lives of people of all faiths and backgrounds who have been marginalized by poverty and hardship. She is a seasoned business professional with 21 years as an entrepreneur for the for-profit natural health sector before transitioning into Jewish community work. She previously served as the executive director at two of Toronto's major synagogue congregations. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology. And then finally, Janet Noel-Annable, no stranger to Cardus. Janet is the CEO of Christian Horizons. As an expression of its Christian faith, Christian Horizons works together with people who experience disabilities to accomplish their goals and nurture communities where everybody belongs. She was appointed as CEO in 2011. She began her career with Christian Horizons in 1988. She's a part-time development services professional in Ottawa. She attended Carleton University. She holds a bachelor's in social sciences and has been active in continuing her education through programs such as the Arrow Leadership Executive Leadership Program and the Ivy School of Business's Leadership Development Program. Please welcome our panelists. Well, great to have you here. Thanks for coming up to Ottawa. This is a really, I think as Ray has highlighted, this is a very interesting study. And I think it maybe goes against what some of us assumed was happening with people of faith in Canada, the attitudes that they have about their own faith, but also how they're perceived by others in our society. So I wanted to sort of start off with maybe a little bit of a tricky question. The data and analysis in this paper seems to say some very interesting things about Canadians' awareness and receptivity to the work of faith communities in the cities and towns of our country. And the three of you are very active sort of on the ground, expressing your faith through work. what we in the Catholic world might call corporal works of mercy. But there seems to be a bit of a block in terms of how the work that we do as people of faith is understood. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on whether we as religious people, are we actually failing to explain who we are, why we do what we do, and who we do it for? And one of my sort of favorite theologians, Father Alexander Schmemann, in one of his great books, talked about for the life of the world. And I think all of us as people of faith, we don't do these things just for our own co-religionists. We do this for the life of the world. So I wanted to just get your thoughts on, are we communicating why we do what we do and who we do it for? Who would like to begin?
Well, I have to, oh, thank you. So I think that it's a really interesting question. And I think, Father Deacon Andrew, the first conversation you and I had, I was very surprised as coming from the Jewish faith, our organization is not ostensibly religious. There's no prayer, there's no worship, there's no reading of sacred texts as a part of what we do. There's an understanding that we are, as Jews, called upon to care for those among us who are in need. And our organization exists to provide a way for ordinary folks from the Jewish community and beyond to provide, to action those concepts and those beliefs. But you know, I recently hired a new communications director, and she wrote something, and it had the word God in it, and I was like, we don't say God. Like we dance around this, really recognizing that while the values and the work that's being done resonates so deeply in the souls of the people who are volunteering with our organization and supporting us financially, once we cross the line into something that is objectively and outside and right out there religious, that can really be alienating to a lot of people who feel uncomfortable with their religion. So while I would say that their souls resonate with these concepts, they're uncomfortable with their relationship to actual faith and actual religion. So we are always dancing around. And I recall in our very first conversation, I thought it was just a Jewish thing. And I was very surprised to hear that this is true in your experience as well. I thought it was just a Jewish thing, that we're a funny people and there's a certain discomfort and I guess, what was the, how did you word it? Questioning. I think that we have a lot of people who are really questioning what is their relationship with their faith and how do they identify as Jewish.
Yeah, so World Sick Organization actually doesn't, I was going to say the answer is no. There we go. We don't do that part of the work. So we do, we're a civil liberties organization. We do a lot of human rights work. We're doing the legal challenge against Bill 21 in Quebec. We do workplace accommodations, the right to wear a kirpan on Via Rail, the right to wear your turban in prison, all of those kinds of things we've done. And we actually make a point to not do the other parts. So it's kind of the glue that holds us together. Because I'm going to quote our lawyer, but he says, if you ask 10 of us a religious question, you're going to get 11 answers. And so we have never done that part of it. There are other Sikh organizations that have the mandate of education or sharing Sikhi with the world. And it's like self-identification. So if you're a Sikh, you're welcome to be here and do this work. And what we're doing is very much Sikh work, but there is no test of what kind of Sikh you are, where all of our members are very much across the spectrum of Sikhi. And then, we don't do that. We don't talk to people about what Sikhi is, when we're not converting people or sharing any of those ideas, but we are, making sure if you have a beard, you can wear a mask and do your job as a security guard and you're not being asked to shave your beard. That's the kind of work that takes precedent over sharing the reason behind the work.
Sorry. And I guess we do. So Christian Horizons is based on the fact that we believe that all people are created in God's image and that all people are loved and valued by God. And the people that we work with are people with disabilities whose society has left out for eternity. And it's actually an interesting space that's what our motivation is, because it actually gives us license to do the work that we do. We invite people of faith and people of not faith to join us in that mission. But it's all based on values that are biblically sound, but going really back to the foundation that we believe that all people are created in the image of God. And that really propels us to social action, to justice initiatives, to, we often refer to faith as not a fence that keeps people out, but a warm pot of soup that invites people in. And yeah, I guess, we're right now on a journey to think about how do people know who we are, what we do, and why we do it, as an act of faith that is accessible to everyone, a radical sort of accessibility.
Well, I think this raises some really interesting questions about the public nature of faith. And Cardus has been very active in this area for a long time. The Halo project that we have looks at the direct impact of faith communities, local congregations on provision of goods and services, social services within a particular city or town. And then our Diaconia project, which some of you participated in, looked at what do people of faith do and why do they do it? And as was referenced by Ray, we've come through this period of a pandemic where, depending on the jurisdiction you were in across the country, there were times when there were very strict controls imposed on public worship. And in some provinces, churches and other places of worship were shut down for up to 6 months. Yet government really values the work that you do and the work that people of faith do when it's providing social services, outreach, these types of things in the public space. But often there seems to be this failure to connect public worship with public action. And so I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about, first of all, two things. Is there sort of an amnesia that exists around why public worship is so important? Because it informs what religious people do. Worship leads to action. And so you can't sort of divorce the two. And the second question is, this is raised by, I think, a couple of you, is there maybe a misunderstanding on the part of government or on the part of other actors within society that really there's a hidden agenda for religious-based charities and religious organizations, that there's sort of an evangelization or a proselytization agenda behind what you do? So how do you sort of address those two challenges? One is a lack of awareness about how worship informs action. And then secondly, what about that secret agenda that all faith communities seem to have when they go into the public space? You want to start, Janet?
A great question, Andrew. I mean, Christian Horizons receives almost $200 million from government a year to do the work that we do. So we work really hard to navigate that space that helps our funders, helps our partners in government recognize the difference that we make. Not, different as a competitive thing from other organizations, but the value add that we bring to our community. So I would say that if we asked our government partners about faith and how it impacts the provision of services for people with disabilities, they may not have an articulate answer. They may not be able to draw a direct connection. But I would say that they would say that we provide a very important service to our community. I think if I was pushing it a little bit further, they might even go as far to recognize that faith communities, some of the work that Christian Horizons does is to help faith communities welcome people with disabilities to belong, benefiting certainly people with disabilities, but also that faith community. And helping kind of bridge that divide between services and community is a really important role that faith communities could have in being active and present so that our government partners can actually see the difference that faith can make in that provision. When you talk about worship leading to action, the pandemic was such an interesting time. The statistics that I read in your report, Ray, are just so interesting and quite honestly frightening and saddening. To see how many people have left faith communities during the time of the pandemic. very differently for people with disabilities. They've actually had more access to faith communities than ever before and are more motivated, and their families are more motivated to actually participate in faith communities because they've been welcomed through technology and through outreach, through, people sewing masks for people during early days of the pandemic, or delivering meals, or recognizing heroes in their community. I actually think we're just in the place that I live, and it's small, I get that. We are actually seeing maybe a different trend happening, which I think is super exciting. And to think about how worship will lead to action in that, we'll see in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah. So I immediately thought of all of the incredible places where we've done stuff that serve the public. And World Sikh Organization partnered with Ontario Casa Darbar, which is the largest Gurdwara in North America, to run a COVID clinic. There are other Sikh organizations. So the Mississauga Food Bank has a hub and spoke model, and one of the food banks is Seva Food Bank, which is a Sikh food bank. So the COVID clinic served people of all faiths. The food bank serves the community, people of all faiths. And recently, the community raised in a radiothon in a weekend $200,000 to create a park where people of all faiths who do cremations, they work with the Conservation Authority of Toronto. So there's a spot in Etobicoke Creek Trail where you can put your ashes in the water. You don't have to go back home, wherever home is, to do that. And these things that are for absolutely everyone, not a single one of them had a second motive. And in the hospital, Brampton is completely underserved in healthcare. There's only one hospital, and for Sikhs, there's a huge intersection between race and faith. And a lot of the funding for the hospital came from the Sikh community. Like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. You go into the emergency room is named after the founder of our religion. So the Brampton Civic Hospital emergency is the Guru Nanak Dev emergency. We funded the emergency room. Every time we are spoken about, it's as if we are service users, not service providers. So we are the people that take from the community. We are the headlines. We are the violent ones. We are the poor ones. And there's never any understanding that every time there's a gap, we step forward, and we are the service providers, and we are pouring, and all of the stuff that we do is community funded. We don't usually get grants or major funding. So it's actually, like, even when you say that, it really makes me think that I really wish we did have that recognition, for someone to be able to say, you don't have an ulterior motive, and you're not doing this because you have some sort of larger agenda. There's enough of us. We don't need, we're not out there trying to get more Sikhs. And it's actually, if anyone is interested, like, if you do choose to become a Sikh, the initiation ceremony, they ask you multiple times if you consent to being there. So they'll ask, did you consent to be here? And then they'll ask, did someone threaten you? Did someone bribe you? And you're asked individually, and you're asked in a group as well. So it's not a motivation. And I don't know that anyone's out there asking for that recognition. I didn't think of it until you asked the question, but it is really difficult to have folks want you to step up and fill the gaps, but not want to acknowledge that you are service providers when the time comes.
Our experience is somewhat similar, and I share some of your frustration that I hear. In that, for example, my organization is almost entirely funded by the Jewish community. All services are for people of all faiths and backgrounds, and that's not something that I think is recognized when a faith-based, a faith-inspired organization raises its funds from a particular population, and that the benefits of the raising of those funds is in service of everybody in Canada. I think that people don't tend to understand that, and that's an equally held value when often it's thought both outside of and within the Jewish community that we're raising funds and running services to take care of our own. And that's actually not the case. And I would say that the broader Canadian public probably would be surprised to hear that a lot of these faith-based organizations that serve the entire Canadian population without discrimination and without agenda or ulterior motives are funded by a particular faith community out of the belief system. The belief doesn't say, love your neighbor who looks like this and drives this car or lives in this house or whatever like yourself. It just says to love the neighbor, the other, the stranger that is among you. And that's very much the motivation for our organization. In terms of ulterior motive, we hear it all the time from the folks that we're serving, and they're typically, so we work with a homeless population in Toronto, and one of our programs is a mobile outreach van, and we go out 7 nights a week and provide hot meals, clothing, harm reduction supplies. And we typically hear from folks like, you're not asking for anything in return. It's like we're not asking for anything. We're not asking you to pray. We're not trying to convert you. For Judaism, we don't do proselytizing, and conversion is not an encouraged thing. So that's just not a part of our mandate at all. But we do encounter folks who are like, so like no strings? It's like no strings. And they're often very, very surprised to hear that and appreciative, obviously.
Ray, you're going to hop in.
It's interesting because we talk about the shifting landscape, and I really think what we're getting at here is the fact that there are two very different understandings of faith in terms of the narrative of public life. And here we have 3 different faith communities on the stage, all coming very much in terms of a very pluralistic understanding. Not faith, not serving just your own community, but a sense that proceeds out of faith motivation, but understanding a service to all humanity. At the same time, nobody on the stage is going to pretend that each of our religions are identical and all the rest, and there are no differences between them, but there is a respect. And the data, I thought I'd not go to the negative slides tonight, but you can, for those of you who have the book on page 48, if you take a look at figure 41, what you will see is that in the question, that I showed positively, I showed that immigrants are the most enthusiastic about all faiths. Slide 41 shows the fact of the religious, the 16% who are the most religious are positive, most positive about everyone. Every faith. The 19% who are non-religious are negative about every faith.
Except themselves.
So there is, which, and I don't want to go all philosophic and Charles Taylor on you here, but really what it talks about is the changing understanding of secularism. We used to have a narrative in public life in which government, the state, the public square was like a referee. They wore a referee jersey and everybody else played. They tried to make sure the rules of the game were fair. What we have now is a secularism that has put on a team jersey, and every other faith is on the other team. And it's a very changing, and what's ironic is that the emerging alliance in terms of data, and this leads me to be reasonably optimistic, frankly, when I take a look at the data of 18 to 34s. I also take a look at the data of immigrants to the country. And I think of the fact that Canada right now, in addition to 500,000 of immigrants we're going to welcome, we have between temporary foreign workers and international students, another 800,000. It's about 1.3, 1.4 million people a year that are coming into this country on a population of 39 million. That's almost 3%.
Who are quite religious.
And the reality is they are twice as likely to be religious as someone who's born and raised in Canada. So the religious demographics, now, they're not all going to, there's a secularizing process. There's a lot more complexity to the data. These are not straight lines. But the process is the religious landscape of Canada is going to change pretty profoundly in the next decade or two in a way that is way more religious and way more pluralistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this begs a certain question. I'll come to Janet in a second. It begs a certain question, especially as we try to relate to those in authority, those in civil authority. Is religion a public good? Do we see religion as a public good? Or is it something that is kind of misunderstood and you don't want to touch it too much? I think if you look at your typical Canadian who's living in a town, city, in a neighborhood, they know that if they want to put their kid into Girl Guides, they can go down the street to Christchurch Anglican and enroll their daughter in the Girl Guides. If they need to take advantage of a 12-step program, they can go to Sacred Heart and sign up for a 12-step program. If they need to feed themselves, they might know that Guru Gobind Singh Gurdwara down the street has the langar, and they can go and receive a meal there. But it seems that when we get above a certain level, especially into government, there's this sort of fear with religion because, well, pluralism is one thing, and we have to sort of, as you said, Ray, adopt what is sometimes referred to as a neutral position, when in fact it's not very neutral at all. There's a certain hostility to the role of religion in the public square. And getting back to a question I asked earlier, are we as religious people doing enough to sort of disavow people of that view of religion? That religion is in fact a good, not just for religious people, but for the community broadly. Janet, you had a point.
Thanks, Father Deacon Andrew. I think in the people that use our services, I would say that they come from all sorts of groups. Some people choose us specifically because we're a Christian organization and they align with our values and they align with our foundation and where we've come from. Others choose us because they believe that the values that we espouse are good values. They may not share those values, or at least the faith foundation of those values, but they think, it's pretty good. I think it'll work. And other people, it's irrelevant. It's more of a geographical question, that sort of thing. But I think and maybe my colleagues in these two other organizations, we have a unique opportunity. We have a unique opportunity to demonstrate a goodness and a welcoming, that radical hospitality that says we serve everybody, that says it's our faith that propels us to do good in the community. And that opportunity is profound. So many times, like I said, the idea of a fence around our faith groups, a fence around us as organizations or religions, is such a mistake. And again, our objective is not to proselytize or evangelize or to change people's perspectives, but it's just to serve. And what an incredible testimony that is to how faith provides within the public space of serving people in need. It is an incredible opportunity.
If I can jump in, one of my ways of thinking is that our organization, half of our mandate is to mobilize members of the community through hands-on experiential volunteerism. And one of the ways that I think that people connect back to the Jewish faith in our case is through this type of service as opposed to traditional worship. And I think that the way we start to, I think that we need to be honest, like in the past, our institutions have made mistakes, and the religions of today we're backpedaling. There have been mistakes made in the past that has led people to feel that religion is judgmental, that religion's doors are not open to everybody, that religion's doors have all kinds of strings attached to them, and they're not a bowl of soup. They are fences. So I really believe that for our organization, we're mobilizing people who are Jewish, who have not had, I guess, a positive experience or a connected or have possibly negative feelings towards organized faith and traditional forms of religiosity. And they connect with us because we serve people of all faiths and backgrounds, because we don't ask anything of them as volunteers. We don't ask them to pray. We don't ask them to be a certain type of Jew in order to participate with us and express their deeply held values, which we hold are Jewish values, whether they identify with that or not. So in a way, organizations like mine that are, they're not overtly religious organizations. Like we sit in a funny place. That is a way I really believe of healing people's relationship to religion. And it's one of our goals through our volunteer program is to help people connect more positively with Judaism. And that's one of the outcomes we measure it through our volunteer program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that same struggle I've had with I think if I look at your charts, I'd be like screaming on the religious side of like, I'm very publicly religious. I literally wear my religion on my head. And I struggle with that tension of like, I know that so much violence and harm that's been done has been done through a system of religion. And it's not a human system. There were people that participated in it. And then the other side of that is that it is necessarily good, which is like Six experienced a genocide in 1984. And part of that, it was so intentionally and thoughtfully done. And it was more than just taking our lives. Our hair was removed, language rights were taken away, water was diverted, land rights were taken away, our libraries were burnt down, our texts were taken away, multiple gordoras were burned down. And I think when a violent government state sits down and says, how are we going to remove their strength? What they're inadvertently naming is our strength. So that to me says, if you want to take a people, if you want to tear them down and you're gonna do it by taking away their religion, then it's necessarily true that restoring that religion builds them up. And we've had folks reach out to World Sikh Organization. We've been a co-sponsor with Sheridan College in Brampton for a summit on international students to build a charter for international student rights, which to me says that the colleges are recognizing that religion needs to be a part of the restoration of identity and keeping people safe. We've had the Peel District School Board reach out, and we've sat on a writing team, and they now have Sikh resource teachers because they are the school board that has the most Sikh students. And so they are necessarily naming that like identity and restoration of identity is a point of strength. There's so much goodness here, and it doesn't have to be like that word with God. Like it's us too, the word with God, and like and even like in some of the questions too, right? When you use the word God, I was like, oh, I wonder how some Sikhs are very comfortable using the word God. I don't know that that's the word I would use to describe Sikh concepts, and so like all of those things, like whether or not we name them, we know that they are good. We know that they are points of strength. And we are actually being pulled into public conversations to support the restoration of identity and to bring some of that strength back.
Before we open up to the audience and also to those online, I wanted to ask just a very simple question. You've all had a chance to look through the report and you heard Ray's presentation. What struck you as most surprising or most interesting about this report and what comes out of it? Who'd like to go first? Carrie.
Yeah. I think it was actually your point near the end, which is something that I've long thought, which was the search to derive greater meaning. And that's, again, we're going about that through this volunteerism, but it's something that I really believe, having spent several years working in synagogues, and I have kids who are in their 20s, and just being around and listening to how people talk, I believe that there's a desperate thirst, a hunger, a desire to connect with something at a different level than daily life. Daily life operates here. You drive in your car and you go to work and you do your things, but there's a desire and an innate drive to aspire to something that is elevated, that is not like daily life. And I was really encouraged to see that in the report, because it's a theory and we've built a lot of programs around it, and it's nice to see some data on it, because I find that very encouraging, because what I think it may speak to down the line, if traditional religiosity is changing in Canada, then maybe it's moving to a place where people are seeking elevation, and it can express itself through work like our work, which is good work for everybody. And maybe it doesn't have to express itself the way it has in the past through formal worship for everybody. It can express itself in different ways, and still be valid, and still bring meaning, and still bring elevation to people.
Yeah, I took a screenshot. So that's what I was like, oh, that's interesting. In the report, it's figure 38. And maybe we could talk about this afterwards, because it was people who checked the box of Sikh, 62% of them said that we should keep God and religion completely out of public life. And I think you said there's a story there, or that was the term you used. And when I'm curious what the story is behind that number, and why. I obviously went straight to the Sikh data in the report, and I wanted to know what all the Sikhs were thinking. And that I thought was really curious, that 62% of people who identified as Sikhs thought we should keep God and religion out of public life. We don't have much of a choice, so I don't know why they're saying that. And then the other thing that was that you put up on the screen, the census data that came out showed that Sikhs are 2.1% of the Canadian population. And that to me is fascinating because we just learned this as well when the census data came out. We're 2% of the population in India. So by proportion, Canada is the country with the most Sikhs, which has given us a real push for like, when we talk about innovation. So like, if all Sikhs keep their hair, initiated Sikhs keep their hair. So like beards and like N95 masks and creating a firm seal, we are now going back to provincial governments and saying, well, you guys are the ones that are going to do innovation for Sikhs, because guess what? You're actually the country with the most proportion of Sikhs. So it's, I can see you're a data person. I think that's a really cool data point to be able to say that Sikhs are going to be a minority no matter where we go, but we are proportionally the most represented here in Canada. Yeah.
2.1 is 5% more.
Okay.
So just when you need to make the number sound bigger.
I think I'm maybe in Carrie's perspective as well, is just the idea, the opportunity that we have to invite people to, whether they're from faith communities or not faith communities or from different faith communities, just to be a part of this effort towards helping our communities. And I think, maybe people aren't going to go back to traditional worship services quickly, but they can get involved in helping their community. And that tangible effort, I think, to be with humans is a wonderful opportunity for all faiths.
Great.
It's interesting to listen to you from a Jewish perspective talk about, that yearning that you picked up on. I found it, as a Reformed Christian, a very, for me, it was very Augustinian. We will find no rest until we find a rest in you, is what Augustine said, and the sense that there is this searching that is there. Here we are, and I'll just make the observation, where with social service agencies and those who are facing the public, and that we find very much the expression in that activity. Yet in the report itself, especially the 16 to 34-year-olds, what we're finding is actually going back to traditional worship, a search for the transcendent, the importance of the sacrament. So we're seeing very different responses to some of these same sorts of things. You asked what was interesting. What was interesting is we had 9 panels of faith leaders that diverted us there. We have 1 panel with social service leaders, and it brings us the other direction, which I thought was a very interesting conclusion.
Absolutely. And I think, I always like to reflect on a point that Rabbi David Novak at U of T makes, where he talks about that every human being has this metaphysical need. Doesn't matter whether you have religious faith or you're atheistic or you're a secular humanist or whatever, there's this metaphysical need that each one of us has to seek out truth. And we're the only creatures that do that. No other creature does that. Human beings do that. The seeking out of meaning, this desire for truth, and we see that manifested in all sorts of ways in our pluralist society. But I mean, when I look at that report, and a lot of the work that I do in my religious life as a deacon is engaging with young adults. And the data that came out about how religious the 18 to 34 crowd are is really interesting. And this desire for authenticity, and that faith leaders reflected on this. And so I think that's maybe we'll get into that in some of the questions that we have, but that was for me a really interesting point. So I'd like to open it up, and a reminder to those online, if you want to put in your questions in that little box, I will get them magically, and I have some already. Rachel's giving me the nod. But any questions from those gathered here? But just please state your name and your affiliation. Yes. The question is, how do faith leaders in particular keep religion active in the public square? And, maybe even just drawing upon your own congregations, your own religious experience. How do you kind of maintain that faithful presence? I mean, you're doing it through your different organizations, but maybe just speaking as a religious person, how do you maintain that faithful presence in the public square?
It's so hard for me to answer that as a minority and as a minor minority, as you saw on the census data. I don't know that we do this in the public square. I mean, certainly there are all sorts of public things, like as Jews in Canada, we're remarkably visible and very out there in, there'll be menorah lightings all over the country in the coming few weeks, and that's a very public thing. when we have students come from Jewish communities around the world, they're often completely shocked by the level of Jewish expression that we are able to have here in Canada. The publicness of our Judaism is something to be very proud of here in Canada, and something that is not experienced around the world. In many Jewish communities around the world, that's not something that's done. So that's our expression in the public square. I think it's less of a question for the minor minorities to be in the public square,
Can I
though.
actually just jump on, though? Because yes, while Jews make up less than 1% of the population, you are the group that actually has the highest level of hate crime
Yes, we do.
against Jews. And what's striking, if I can just conflate for a moment, anti-Semitic behavior as we see way too much of in terms of the desecration of synagogues, which are part of the news almost weekly somewhere or other. I also think of, earlier last year in the face of the residential schools, we had the burning, 67 churches, primarily on Indigenous, within a couple of months. And what was striking for me as someone who read the coverage of all of that was actually the way that faith leaders responded to that persecution that was very distinctive from the hate that they had just received. I find that, and it's interesting in terms of even the context of suffering that is there in terms of how to deal with it. That sometimes we tell our stories, not just in the positive way in terms of doing it, but we tell our stories as we respond to suffering as individuals or communities. And in that way, there is something very distinctive that comes from the faith community in Canada. So, yeah, it was just when you said the minorities, that was just jumping up in terms of, wait a minute, I read hate data. It's not that minority, but it actually is a witness.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump on that as well, Ray. I think making meaning of our faith in the really hard days as well as in the good days is so helpful to do what you asked. I mean, I think, and maybe it's because I have one foot in the public square and one foot in the faith community, trying to bring that together and make meaning of it, to make it relevant to not just people of faith, but people in the public, and to demonstrate that in a really, like in a regular, tangible way, I think is what sustains me. I think when you work in an organization like Christian Horizons, you are called to be who you are in every single space that you're in, which sometimes is exhausting for sure. But it also requires you to, like your A's be A's and your yays be yays and your nays be nays. And that is sustaining for sure. And I think helpful to make meaning of what faith means to people.
World Sick Organization has been quite adamant that we be public with our religion. We're fighting Bill 21 in Quebec. And I think I was raised in the public school system, and I was told that I was in a secular system, and it wasn't true at all. I sang to a God every morning, and I carried crosses, and I sang to baby Jesus. I did all of those things, and I was not negatively impacted by any of them. I wish people Merry Christmas, and I find it very difficult that the solution seems to be to pull Christianity out of a secular space because we were calling it secular instead of naming it as Christian. And I think I would love to see a welcoming in of everyone in that space, which is what I think we're fighting for in this legal challenge. And even in places where we're not doing it in a legal challenge, to do it in a softer way is to say those things were not bad. What was bad was that the other things weren't there as well. And so can we make space for all of those things? And can we use, like the school system and other public spaces to definitely I keep saying those words, restoration of identity, because that's the work that the Peel District School Board has opened up for us, but to actually bring those identities back in and to name the strength that's in them.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions from those online. Just a very quick question to you, Ray, sort of more of a methodology question. Is atheism considered a religion in the context of the surveys?
In terms of the identification, you could check atheist, agnostic, no religion. So there were various of those boxes. And we didn't, for the rest, define religion. We measured 7 behaviors that in combination were characteristic of religion. So we ducked that question.
And if I remember correctly, those that exhibited either zero or one of those behaviors were sort of in the non-religious category, and that's
correct.
A catch-all.
That was a catch-all, yeah. But it was based on their behaviors, not on their identity.
Right. So another question from those online. How does polarized thinking impact religious communities' ability to serve their communities, their ability to express their identity? I'm not sure what is implied by polarized thinking, but maybe, is there maybe we can speak about the polarization within society. We've already talked a little bit about this, but how people maybe perceive religion, and how do we address with the perception of religion within society, and does that limit the ability to serve the broader community? Maybe just quickly, just kind of reflecting on that, we've already talked a little bit about it.
It limits fundraising. It can be good for fundraising, but I need those strategies. I need those strategies. I've been to like charity galas. I once saw like art being auctioned. It was for a wonderful cause. And like $60,000 was like right in front of my eyes. And we cannot pull numbers like that because there's a lot of fear around what we're gonna do with that. Yeah, there's definitely I took a cab to the hotel I'm staying in. I told the person why I was here, and my cab driver gave me a very stern. He should have been on this panel. Very, very strong response to why everything I believed was wrong and why I shouldn't be doing this. And it's not new, that polarization, and I don't know if this is the answer the person is looking for, but my faith gives me a really strong, I'm not wavering in who I am. And there's a really strong sense of who I am and really strong inner peace. And I accept that people have been hurt, and he had his reasons and he had been so hurt. And I accept that hurt as a part of the critical thinking of understanding who we are and the history of our systems, as it's something it's such a deep and personal act of love and experience of love. And then it's at the same time a violent system. And so like to sit with those two truths and to be able to accept other people's pain, I accept that polarization. It's part of what it is.
I really agree, and it really mimics what I was saying before, which is I do think that people have been hurt by organized religion in the past. However, it's expressed itself in a variety of ways, I think we need to accept that by expressing religiosity in a way that is accepting, that is welcoming, that is breaking down all of those things that so many people would criticize religion for having been in the past, that has hurt them deeply, by being consistent, by being, walking our talk and expressing ourselves in a consistent way that is actually far more reflective of the faiths we represent in these institutions. Over time, we will heal, and we will enable other people to heal as well.
I think one of the question begs a bit of definition in terms of, there is the polarization, and religion can be polarizing. And there are polarizations within religion in which people claim the tenets of the religion as the basis for their side of the polarization. And if you don't agree with that, you're not only wrong on that issue, you're also an unbeliever, or you can't be a faithful member of that. On the other hand, religion also has the capacity to be a larger umbrella to overcome some of the polarizations that exist in society, and actually can be a healing and a uniting way. It depends on the question very much about which you are polarized. If the question is, what does it mean to be human and all the rest, there are some pretty polarizing views out there, and religion is on one side, is on quite a different side than certain others. So it really depends on the issue.
And I would say two things really quickly. A couple of decades ago, we changed our hiring policy. We used to hire only Christians, and we changed that 2008, I think, or so. And you would have thought that, I think we had a lot of assumptions that we all thought the same. And reality was, when we only hired Christians, there were so many diverse opinions that it was shocking. And the second thing I would say is that when people know that I work for a Christian organization, I have to very quickly figure out what they think about that, because if there's 10 people in the room, 10 people think differently about what that means. And it takes a lot of words to explain the, how faith propels us to action and what we do every day. It definitely is, it's very varied in what people think about that.
Well, welcome to Cardus. That's our experience every day. This is this really interesting ecumenical venture that works well, despite the fact we have very different views on theology and ecclesiology and all sorts of things. So there is that healthy diversity that can exist. I'm going to take a couple questions maybe at a go. So yes, just again, say who you are and your affiliation. The second question raises the whole question again of authenticity and how people desire authenticity. Again, we saw in that cohort of the 18 to 34s, not only do they desire to be religious, but they want to go deep. They want to go really deep. And this came across all the meetings that Ray and I had across the country. This theme came up again and again and again at this sort of sense of wonder of young people wanting to go deep. And then the second question was really, again, around, I just lost my train of thought. Quebec and the data in Quebec. So maybe you want to start with that, Ray?
So first of all, our sample sizes are not large enough to start to dig down to one province, to one demographic and state with statistical certainty. So consequently, none of that is in here. We only published that which we can back with the sort of statistic. We are continuing some research, and actually we have a poll that's going in the field, that is in the field right now this week, that will come out just prior to Christmas, in which we have a sample size of 4,000. Just a very quick 101 on methodology. Your sample size doesn't guarantee you anything. There are 40 people in this room. If I pull a poll question out and you come up with 40 different answers, I'm going to need a sample size of thousands to figure out what is representative. If I threw that poll question out to the 40 and it was 38 to 2, the chance, and if this was a randomly gathered sample, the chances are if I came up with 200, it still would be, 38, 90%, whatever. So depends on what we call the homogeneity or the of background. Why I say that is usually data follows a bell curve. In Quebec, we have an inverse bell curve. So you have extremes on both sides. You have, yes, it is true 18 to 34 are the most positive. Yes, it is true that 18 to 34 are the most negative at the same time. So you're seeing much of that in Quebec. The challenge of that sort of data, when those sorts of it comes, is you need you need huge data sizes. The collective data that's represented in this report is well over $1 million. This is not cheap stuff to do. So I'd love to have a good answer to your question. Unfortunately, the data hints at a negative, an inverted bell, both extremes overrepresented and not much in the middle. A polarized result.
Jaspreet, on this question of authenticity, I mean, you stated it very well. Basically, I am who I am. This is who I am. I'm not going to be anything else. So engage me as I am. And this seems to resonate really strongly again in this 18 to 34 cohort. And they're either, not religious, or they're religious. There's not much in the middle. And there's that kind of hollowing out that Ray spoke about. So again, what's your experience of maybe that age group who are coming in, whether it's into the WSO or whether it's to, Christian Horizons or Weerhafte, how they desire that authenticity and they want to live it out? What's your experience with that?
I'm also a child and youth care practitioner by trade. So this is like the intersection, like my passion for Saki and my work actually do like community work with young people. It's absolutely, it's that there's no, I think I heard you use the word mysticism. Like that's the kind of thing that really appeals to me. Those are my moments of connection where I don't want to use my head, or I want to use my heart or my body or a different part of who I am to connect. And I do find with younger folks, there's a lot there's a lot more questions. There's a lot more digging down to what's really there. I find it's a challenge, but I find it's a challenge that I'm up to. We were trying to explain the concept of sovereignty, and we started with Moana, I think. Like we were like trying to find like pop culture references for like how young folks could understand sovereignty, and it's really beautiful. I think it helps me understand my own faith in a different way. Yeah.
I want to know what Moana is.
It's a Disney movie.
I don't have any.
I are not 18 to 34.
It's such a great question. And I think for us, it's just different groups of people. I think there's some young people that come join us and they are so excited to help people live out their citizenship and think about, helping someone get their first job, build their first relationship, get their first apartment. To be able to journey with somebody who's been left out of society is a real act of faith, whether someone is propelled by their own faith or they see it around them. Like, I think there's just different ways that people are motivated. I think at Christian Horizons almost 60 years ago, the Reese family, they had a son with a disability born, and they looked around and there was only really awful institutional care for people with disabilities. And their faith compelled them to start our organization, which, I think of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have been helped in those decades because this family's faith propelled them to action. Probably your organization, Carrie, the same thing. A group of people saw something wrong in the world and they were motivated by their faith to make a difference. And yeah, how do we propel or grow that for the future? I don't know. I look at these numbers and I find it troubling. But I don't think it's going to be inside a church community. I think a lot of it is the church being present in the community or the synagogue or the, what's the name? Godoya, being present in their community. I think that's what's going to make a difference for people.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about authenticity, particularly with young adults, like they have the authenticity detectors out there. The antennae are up at that age, and that's part of the previous disillusionment with religion. You say one thing and you do another, and that flies in the face of that whole desire for authenticity. So again, obviously I agree with you. And I really see that as we action these values, we don't just say nice stuff and talk about nice stuff and read nice stuff. We go out and we do, and they see that congruity between what we say we believe and what we actually action. I think that's where it's like, okay, I can buy that. Like, I can buy that you're not perfect. I can buy that, maybe sitting and praying is not my thing, but I sign up for something that says we believe this beautiful concept and we action it. We do the stuff.
Just the other day, a good friend of mine sent me a wonderful quotation by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs about this exact question. And Rabbi Sachs said, non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism. And they are embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by Judaism. And I think that applies across religions. And I think we respect one another and also are respected, I think, broadly in society when we are authentic and we stand by what we believe and we act based on those beliefs. And people do see that. So I want to just, we're come to our time. We're very good at Cardus about keeping to time. And so I would like to really thank our three panelists for the insights they provided this evening. And now certainly, Janet, we've known you for some time, but now we count on Jaspreet and Carrie as friends of Cardus. So thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us. And thank you, Ray. Thank you. And Cardus is a Christian organization, but we really emphasize that we are hospitably Christian. And so we try to reach out to other faith communities, and we really, again, value these opportunities, especially now that we can be back together on a more regular basis. We do have copies of the paper, and they're available just in the entryway. And we've also sort of scattered about the place a few of the copies of our Diaconia project that looked at various 8 faith communities and how they live out their faith through different faith organizations. And 2 of those organizations were Christian Horizons and Ve'ahavta. So we have the profiles that describe Ve'ahavta and Christian Horizons. You can find them about as well. Thank you again for coming this evening. God bless you.